All right, Liana, I am thrilled to have you on the show today. We're going to get a little bit to our backstory in a minute, but I want to start by talking about this company that you are part of. It's called FOLX Health, and let's focus on the important work that you all do over at FOLX Health.
Yeah. Well, first of all, Aaron, thank you for having me. It's lovely to be able to connect one-on-one like this. So yeah, I am at FOLX Health, and we are the world's largest provider of healthcare for the LGBTQIA community. So we are a digital platform, and we started in 2020 with a focus on gender-affirming hormone therapy for the trans community. We knew from day one that we wanted to care for the entire LGBTQIA community, but we felt like the trans community represented the greatest need. And so, given that we were a startup, we started with a focus there and then have steadily expanded. So, today we offer primary care and mental health services to the broad LGBTQIA community, as well as a community platform and care navigation services. And, it is deeply meaningful work because we live in a world where the incumbent system was at best not built for this community, and more often than not, openly discriminatory and or violent. And so we're able to create a better life for, the 10+% of the population that is part of this community.
Well, thank you for doing that because as a dad of a gay daughter and a bi daughter, we need all the support and help that we can get. And obviously, it's a difficult time out there. I'm going to ask you a sidebar question just because I know that we have a fairly broad audience. These are people that are listening to leaders that are doing societal good. I think a lot of people are familiar with the LGBTQ plus. And I know the IA has come into usage, I want to say over the last few years. Can you tell us like why that's important and why maybe this acronym keeps expanding? Because I know there are some people that are very dismissive. They're like, why do we need to keep doing that? But I feel like you're probably pretty well equipped given your focus to
Yeah.
help for our listeners answer that question.
Well, I will say, I think for regardless of what letter you are in the LGBTQIA plus, you likely had at least a period in your life, if not much of your growing up, where you felt very deeply lonely and unseen. And I think for those of us who have experienced that, and I grew up in a life that was deeply accepting. Like when I came out, I wasn't worried that my family was going to write me off. But even in that context, I felt very lonely. I felt very much like, was I going to be able to live the life that I wanted to live? And so for me, I think two things. One, the community is not a monolith. So we don't, just by virtue of our sexual orientation, it doesn't mean we're all the same, right? And so I think it is really important that we be as inclusive as possible. And I think that that is doubly important when you think about the fact that maybe the thing we probably most have in common is that we have felt lonely because of our sexual orientation or identity or gender identity. And so I think, adding more letters just to me is a way of signifying that, we accept people as a community, and that, we are not putting up barriers to being a member of the community, but rather really, building the experience that a lot of us wish we had had.
I really like that answer a lot because you didn't get into the nitty gritty and that feeling lonely piece. And I think making sure that it is all inclusive does help. So I appreciate you answering that as a little sidebar that I didn't send over in my prep questions. But again, you seem like you'd be a good person to answer that for us. So speaking of folks' health, you've had an interesting journey. It's actually probably more linear the more I looked at your LinkedIn and read your profile than I originally had thought. But you started as a marketing associate way back when at Axiom, and then you've moved into the CEO role at Folks Health now. But you had stops along the way as the COO at Blockchain, which that one was a little bit of like, that's interesting, but probably helpful. And
Yeah.
then CMO at Skillshare along the way. Like, let's talk about that journey and how did you go from marketing to operations to chief executive?
Yeah. I love that you felt like there was some linear path because I feel the same way. I think but for me, the linear nature of the path is that, I've never had the same title twice and I've never worked in the same industry twice. So that's where it's nonlinear. Where it is linear, though, is that I've exclusively worked for organizations that I felt were making the world a better place and where I felt like we were building a different future. And so I started at Axiom. When I graduated from college, I thought I wanted to be a lawyer. I was a paralegal for a year, realized pretty quickly that the thing I thought was true about law, which in my head was you take these really nuanced problems and find novel solutions. And what I realized was that that's quite the opposite of what lawyers are often doing. They're often, it's a very precedent bound profession. And so as I was coming to that realization, I found Axiom, and it was sort of this new version of a law firm. And when I say it makes the world a better place, that may not sound like it's making the world a better place, but I can't tell you how many lawyers we had practicing at Axiom who had been always, the overachievers, did what they felt like they should do from a career progression perspective, and looked up and felt like they never got to be home with their kids, and they didn't feel like the work they were doing was meaningful. And by virtue of coming to a place like Axiom, they were able to build that work life balance while still having really meaningful impact in a work environment. So I did that for almost a decade. And for me, I kept learning more and more. I was in the marketing space during an era where marketing probably underwent more changes than ever before and even since,
Right.
right? So it was like right as social media was coming into play and we were moving from very sort of old school paths to new paths. Like, I was right there for the birth of SEO and social media marketing. And so the learning trajectory just kept being steep, which was interesting to me. And then after a decade, I felt like I'd learned everything I was going to learn, and I got a call, and there was a role at Blockchain for the first marketing hire. And then within a couple of months, I became the chief operating officer. And what drew me to that was this idea of financial access and equity. And, I was there for about 4 years, and at the end of the 4 years, realized that that vision that I had that was really energizing for me was probably 10 or 20 years out. And I wasn't passionate enough about the present day use case to stick it out. And I thought they deserved somebody who was more passionate about that use case in that role. And so I moved over to Skillshare, which was an online learning platform focused on creativity, and then got the call for FOLX a few years in. And when I got the call for FOLX, historically, I'd been offered other president and CEO roles, and I had turned them down because I'm really crystal clear that my North Star is my two kids, and I will care about two things more than anything else when I take my final breath, and they are, did I raise good people, and do I have a good relationship with them? And I think being CEO often is in direct tension with that, right? I'm on a plane a lot, I'm gone a lot. So I think only for the exact right thing would I have taken this role. And for me, folks, was that right thing. You know, my hypothesis when I started thinking about it was I don't think I'll ever, no single day will feel like work. It will all feel like a deep privilege and an honor. And that in and of itself is an amazing thing for me to model for my kids. And I'm a few years in, and that is very much the case. I feel deeply grateful every morning when I wake up that I get to do this work.
How awesome is that? And I love the fact that you mentioned that about your kids and just, that you waited for the right opportunity because you knew that there would be a sacrifice. But I like the idea of modeling something and doing what you love for your kids. I feel like I had the opportunity to do that very similar background, which I won't bore people with, but it's interesting where you get into something and you're like, I want to do this. And I think this is where it's going to be. And you realize like, no, they're not going to get there fast enough. So let me go and do something else. During my research, I did see that you made a prestigious list, probably one of many prestigious lists, but I didn't know this existed before, and it actually made me happy that it did. It was Fast Company's Queer 50 list, and this was a few years back. But what was most impressive, and you talked about your long lineage in the world of tech with different flavors to it, there are leaders from other companies, in addition to Land O'Lakes, a very famous tech company, Reddit, Airbnb, Meta, and Apple. I'm glad you got that. What did making this list mean to you?
It was deeply touching. I think for me as a kid, like I said, I grew up in a world where, I felt like if I lived my truth as a Latina lesbian out in the world, I was going to have to make sacrifices. And I didn't quite know exactly what those would look like, but there was fear, like, was I going to be able to build a career? Was I going to be able to have a family? Was I going to be able to live comfortably in my skin? And so to be a part of that list was such a validation of the life I've been able to build, and how grateful I am for the opportunities that I've had that have gotten me there. And to have lived in an era, and I think we're seeing a little bit of a pullback on this, which is really deeply sad, but to have lived in an era that valued diversity and understood that, difference was really could be really powerful, and not just because it was the right thing to do, but actually could be good for business. And so, um, it was also really nice, like, the 11-year-old in me looking at that list and feeling like, "Wow, there are a lot of us out there who have built lives that we're proud of and that bring us a lot of joy." I think that that little kid in me felt, deeply seen and grateful.
Well, that's so cool. And I love, I have that inner 11-year-old in me sometimes as well. And it's funny that you geek out about that. It does remind me, by the way, this is another sidebar, but something you said during your panel, which we will touch on in just a minute. But what you just said reminded me of that. And that was things like going to the doctor's office and mentioning my wife and wondering about the reaction. And I'm saying this because it again, especially having a gay daughter, it breaks my heart that people judge you, for your skin color or your background or your sexual orientation. And so, can you just spend like 30 seconds on that because that was like a very heartfelt moment during the
Yeah.
panel that I saw you on.
Yeah, I mean, it's just the reality of what it means to be who I am in this world, right? And so there are certain places that I won't travel to because it's illegal to be gay, and I'm somebody who loves to travel and would love to see all parts of this world, but I won't risk going to places where my very being is illegal. And it happens in big, like that's a big thing I think about a lot, but it happens in small ways, I would say dozens of times every week. Like when I get in an Uber in another city and someone says, "Oh, do you have, your husband and kids?" I have this moment of like, do I correct them that I'm not married to a man and I don't have a husband, or do I just let it slide? And that is a deeply painful way. It's a heavy weight to carry, right? Because there's no right answer, right? It's like if I correct them, I, in some cases, could be putting myself at risk. But if I
Right.
don't correct them, it feels like I'm renouncing the life that I love and am so grateful for. And it happens all the time. It happens like when we're walking and I like if my wife and I are holding hands, I think about like, is that safe? Is somebody going to say something to us? The same is true when I go to the doctors. It's just, and you're constantly looking for these like small signals that, I think those of us in this community or anybody in a marginalized group, grows up knowing to look for as a way of protecting our safety. And I think it is really underappreciated how heavy that is to carry all the time and how frankly exhausting it is, right? Like it is more work to walk through the world than it is for my cis straight counterparts.
Well, I'm sorry on behalf of society and, any of us that create that scenario. And it breaks my heart because it's like when my wife told me about walking the dogs out in the park, like up in the, foothills and just how women have to behave versus men. And I'm like, wow, I never would have thought of that.
Yeah. Erin, I love that you brought that up. I mean, another example is I was with a bunch of friends at one point and we were talking about it was men and women, and the women were talking about how these new car keys are hard for us because we were all raised with the idea of you take your car key and you walk with it between your fingers so that if somebody attacks you, you can hit them with the key. And we were shocked because all of the men had no idea that women did that. And all of the women had no idea that men didn't know that we did that. And so, I want to be clear, it's not specific to the LGBTQI community. I think there are a lot of marginalized groups. And frankly, women make up more than 50% of the population in the US. Like it's not even a minority, but it is marginalized. And so I think, back to your first question around why do we keep adding letters? Because the more we can make people feel seen, the more we can acknowledge their reality, the more we can create this future world where no one feels unseen.
Well, hopefully, this is one baby step toward that. This is on the next day of the elections that we just had, and not to get political, but I feel like that was a nice response to some of the things that are going on right now and the people that got elected. I was appreciative of the fact that Prop 50 passed here in California. Not that I like gerrymandering, but sometimes you have to fight fire with fire. So we digress.
Yes.
One of the things that I do want to get into, so beyond the queer 50 list, which I'm sure, those are people that you love and respect or appreciate, or many of them. I do want to get into, are there other gay leaders or prominent figures in society that you look up to that you would like to highlight on our talk today?
Yeah. I mean, the two names that come to mind for me are Eileen Shaken, who created the L word. Um, and I don't need to highlight her, like she's very well known, particularly within our community. But I think a lot about the impact of art to drive, to change people's hearts and minds. And
Hmm.
I cannot tell you how many queer folks of a certain age, like I'm in my early 40s, so people kind of around my age for whom that show was a lifeline. It either was the first, and, for me in particular, I'll share, like, it was the first time I had seen lesbians who could be successful and could have families and could have community and could be themselves fully. And so I'm deeply grateful because that wasn't a given, right? Like that was an era where it was hard to get people to buy into the idea of making something like that. And so, that's a name that comes to mind. The other name that I think about a lot is Andrea Gibson, who is a poet who just passed away. And I have their poetry books right above me. And I think their words have a way of meeting any moment. And I think their impact absolutely is already transcending their time on Earth. And so they are someone that I'm just so grateful that my time overlapped with theirs and that I get to experience their art and will be able to share that with my children. And so I think those are the two names that jump out at me.
Those are great answers, and I think I will link to one or both of them in the show notes because I do like people to be able to do exploration, and especially if it's a poet that has words for all instances, because we all need that. One person, and I know I tied your hands on this one a little bit, but a very famous gay leader that I've been particularly impressed with is Pete Buttigieg.
Hmm.
And I think he's really stepping up and speaking truth to power. And, I would love to get your thoughts on him. Does he have a shot at POTUS or vice president somewhere down the road? Might not be this cycle, but maybe in the next 6 or 10 years.
I would say so. I'm also very impressed by him. I think he's a prime example of someone who is exactly kind of the life stage that I had. He talks a lot about how like Tucker Carlson just called him out and said he's pretending to be gay, and his response to that was, honestly, there's a little bit of a gift in thinking that like that could be a value add for me because I spent most of my life thinking that I would only pay a price for this. And I agree with you. I think he's able to really speak truth to power in a way that people can identify and see themselves in him regardless of where they fall in the political spectrum. He doesn't shy away from he is working really hard to step outside of our echo chamber into other conversations and really trying to, I think, earnestly have a back and forth about ideas versus sort of leaning into this identity based politics that I think people are trying to push in an effort to just harm marginalized groups. um in terms of can he win, I hope so, Aaron. I really do. I find myself very saddened by what I view as the difficulty that very qualified women have faced in running for the highest office. I think people are comfortable with women in power up to a certain point. I don't think we've ever tested if that's true for the queer community. But, I think he certainly I think he has introduced the humanity of what it means to be part of this community. And I think he brings to light that we just want to have our families and live our lives. I mean, you'd be hard pressed to look at him and his husband and his kids and not think that's a loving family. I don't know how you could look at that family and think they shouldn't exist.
Totally.
So I hope he could win. And I think even if he runs and doesn't win, by virtue of putting himself out there, I think he has already made a huge difference in the perception of our community and the way future generations will perceive our community.
Yeah, that's a great answer, and I really do hope he does, and I do hope that he could win because I feel like he's got so much EQ like all across the board, and the fact that he has a military background, which helps negate the fact that it's like, well, what has he done? It's like, well, probably more than 95% of you, because you armchair tough guys want to sit there and judge, but this is a guy that's actually seen the battlefield and is a loving dad and a loving husband and all these things that you just mentioned.
Well, and I think the current Republican Party has neutered their ability to argue that people need to have a certain amount of experience to take on roles. Like they have built an entire administration of people
Right.
who have next to, little to no experience in the roles that they're taking on. And so, I think there's not a lot of great that I see in this administration, but I think maybe if I were to try to silver lining it, I would say like, passion and connection goes a long way. Now, I hope that passion and connection is tied to somebody with ethics and morals that, really hold us to our highest ideals.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think somebody like Pete could do that. I think there are a lot of people on the left who could step into that.
Yeah, that's a good point. Actually had that argument and listened to people saying one of the good things about the current administration is you have business people in roles versus just people that have been in politics their whole life that may or may not. But you hit that, key word on the head, which is you do actually have to have the experience. And unfortunately, in many of these cases, the folks appointed have not. So anyway, we will move on and we've hit the third rail with the politics, but it's kind of hard to avoid, I think, in this. And this does actually tee up this next conversation, which is you first came onto my radar at the health conference last month. That's HLTH. I'm sorry that it took this long, but I'm glad we finally got there. This is a health innovation conference that brings together 12,000 of the most important people in healthcare. And you were on a really important panel led by a good friend, former colleague, Mary Stutz, who leads the Healthcare Businesswomen's Association. And the title was very cleverly worded, Changing the Words, Not the Work, which I think is more important now than ever. Can you share a little bit more about that panel?
Yeah, so I think we're in this moment where people are really worried to step in and take on the mantle of DEI. And I actually just wrote a piece for my Substack on this framework of sort of this Venn diagram of right, righteous, and effective. And I think in an ideal world, you can be all three things. You can have all three turned all the way to 10. And we're living in a world today where people are having to make really hard trade-offs between being righteous and being effective. And in some places, having a big DEI focus that is publicly stated as such may actually prevent you from being able to be effective, right? Because it puts a target on your back. We have an administration that has said that they want to sue and put out of business anybody that is pursuing diversity, equity, or inclusion, which is insane to me. And so, people are faced with these really hard decisions around we continue to care about this community. We do not want to walk away from them. But if we focus too much on the words, it may actually prevent us from doing the work. And so that was the conversation. And I think, my fellow panelist, Felix, who's at Doximity, was saying, it is fair to make some of those trade-offs. I do love that he was also saying, but the words actually do matter, right? And so some of it is you have to assess what the real risk is in sticking with the words, because for those of us who are marginalized or who are, who feel like, we make a small part of a team and we want to make sure that we're respected, when you start to say we actually don't care about diversity, equity, and inclusion anymore, you can do more harm than maybe what you're protecting in walking away. And so I think it was a really interesting conversation. There's no perfect or right answer, but I think it really speaks to this moment in time and how people are navigating this moment. I think what I will say is the piece that feels missing to me in a lot of these conversations is there's also a very real risk to walking away from these communities in this moment. We will remember, like when you look at the LGBTQI community, 50% of people, roughly, just a little bit lower than that, are not out at work. We make up 10% of the population today, but it's 25% of Gen Z. And we will remember. We will remember, and the pendulum will swing. And I think there's a real risk to people who sort of were very performative a handful of years ago and then are dialing it back completely. And then, in a few years when the pendulum swings and they want to then, recapitalize on the moment, I think people are going to call them out. And so a lot of the panelists focus on if you're worried about the words, how can you make sure you're doing the work so that you're really doing the right thing for the long term? And that's where the right comes in. You might have to make some changes on the righteousness to drive effectiveness, but you really cannot lose sight of what's right.
Well, that was a stat that you did use, and I do have another question that I want to drill into, and then I'd love to get some of the stats that you talked about. So you mentioned, 1 in 10, I think we've known this for the last 30, 40 years that was the stat. And then you mentioned that 25% of Gen Z are. I'm going to hazard a guess that it's actually always been 25% and that just we lived in a society, and Liana's violently shaking her head for those that can't
Yeah.
see her. And it's crazy because, I won't go down this path because it's going to be too personal and I don't want to share this on their behalf. But there are people in my life that are important people that we suspect at the very least are bi and probably gay and we're married. And so it is sad to me that they couldn't live their life because they grew up in a time where it wasn't possible. So one of the things I do want to get into, though, is you kind of blew me away with some of the stats you shared about the FOLX Health app and what it's doing. And one of them in particular, and you did such a gorgeous job doing this, you likened the fact that the productivity and happiness that your app gives back to the LGBTQIA plus community at work was essentially the equivalent of giving them a February back, because I think it was like 2 days a month of productivity and happiness.
Great
So
memory, yeah.
talk a little more about that stat, and maybe if there are any other stats you want to share that your platform brings to this very
Yeah.
important population.
Yeah, I'm very impressed with your memory on that. I think it's really important. Like when I joined Folks, so I'm not the founder. I was brought on as CEO, like I said, in 2022. So almost 4 years ago, actually, it was early 22. And we talked a lot about like, are we a DEI solution? Are we a healthcare solution? And where we landed was we're all of it. But ultimately, we actually have to meaningfully improve the lives of our members. And so early on, we set out to make sure that we were collecting data to understand the true impact of the work that we're doing. And what we found was some softer data, like 100% of our members see their clinician as a partner in their care, and 99% feel like they're making meaningful headway towards their health goals. Those are softer measures, but they are so important. I think you'd be hard pressed to find anyone in the US who feels that good about their healthcare experience. But then there are some harder stats. So we use, the GAD and the PHQ-9 and the CDC Healthy Days metrics to assess, sort of how we're improving people's lives. And what we found was that 59% of people who come to us with suicide ideation have that fully resolved at the 3-month mark and stay free of suicidal thoughts past that point. 54% have a clinically significant decrease in anxiety and depression. And when you look at the Healthy Days metric, like you said, members, about 40% of them get an additional 2 days per month for work and play. When you think about 2 days per month, that's essentially another February that we can give people to engage as they see fit. And so, you know, we're making people not just healthier, but happier. And that is a virtuous cycle, right? It's part of the way, like when we think about the platform we're building, I often say to people, we're building the future of healthcare writ large, which in our mind has three important components. It is whole person. So I think we're going to look back and think it was crazy that we separated mind from body and you went to one set of practitioners for therapy and mind care and one set for physical, your physical body. So we do both. We provide talk therapy, peer support groups, and then primary care services. We think it is patient centered. I think for too long, patients are kind of the widgets in the system when they should be the core. And so, our perspective is that the magic happens when we bring our clinical expertise, but you combine that with your expertise on what it means to walk in your body every day. And I think when you do that, you can get things like, even though we're a digital solution, we can help rid you of suicidality within 3 months. And then the third prong is it's community oriented, because I think the reality is, right now in America, we have a sick care system. So we allow people to get sick based on a lot of systems and policies, and then we treat that illness. We do not have a healthcare system. And I think when you think about actually moving to health and wellness and getting people to be healthy and stay healthy, community is an important part of that. And so we bring people together in that way because we know that it drives improved outcomes. And it's those three things together that we think is really going to be the future of healthcare. We happen to be doing it for this community. More.
Well, again, thank you for all of that. And I think we all probably have people in our lives that have been touched by the, suicidality piece and the depression piece. And so the fact that you're able to give them solutions and hope and help is just so critically important. And that was one of the things, again, I had not heard of folks. Actually, I think I may have heard of it, but I didn't really know much about what you did. And so to hear not only those details, but the impact of what you're doing was incredible.
Yeah. Well, and I will say, Aaron, like one thing I would add to it too, and this I'm stealing from FOLX, who was on the panel with
From
me.
Doximity.
Yeah, from Doximity, and he was talking about how, essentially rising seas lift all ships sort of mindset. Like, I think the thing to remember is it's not just that you're helping this community when you allow them to access this kind of care. Our community faces 200 times higher inpatient admissions. If we can have, and 40% of members of our community actively avoid seeking healthcare, which is how they end up in the ER when a lot of it could have been solved if they had a practitioner that they trusted. And that not only has all the impact that I just mentioned for our members, for, broadly, you think about it, right? That if we can get more people to get healthy and health and wellness care, like that means lower wait times in the ER. If we can get those people to have just the same stats as our counterparts on the ER, we can have lower wait times for everybody. We can bring the cost of healthcare down for everybody. Like we can take a system that is already overtaxed and bring it right size it. And so I want to also just be really clear that there may be a feeling of, oh, I'm glad you're doing that for that community. I don't really know anybody in that community. And to that I would say, one, yes you do, whether you realize it or not. And two, actually this helps you too. And so I think it's important to just to make clear that this isn't just a very niche thing. This is actually something that can help our healthcare system as a whole.
Thank you for saying that because that's really important. And I think going to that bigger topic of DE&I, what people don't remember is that it is actually economically beneficial to companies to have a diverse board and to have a diverse workforce. It has been scientifically and economically, numerically proven that that's the case. So I really appreciate that you added that in there. I do want to add on because the focus of this show is people that are leaders that are doing societal good. Clearly, you're doing that in your day to day job, but you also have been involved in a couple of pretty prominent charities. And the first one, which I don't think you're as active in, but it was something called the Pink Agenda, which you helped co found in 2007. And it's a 401(c)(3) focused on breast cancer care, which is sorry, we missed Breast Cancer Awareness Month last month, but still important, 12 months a year, the care, the research, and the awareness among young professionals. So tell us about creating TPA and what it taught you about philanthropy.
That's such a great question. Yeah, I mean, we started it. I think the first thing I learned about philanthropy through that experience was how limited it is in terms of who can access that and who can support. So, my best friend at the time, her mom was sick. She had stage 4 metastatic breast cancer. She also had MS. So, sort of mind blowing that despite being at the doctors all the time for MS, they missed the breast cancer diagnosis. And she ended up passing away a couple years after we started the Pink Agenda. But at the time, we were feeling really lost. Like, how do we support? How do we, you just want to do something, and we were doing things at home to help her mom, but how do we help make this not the reality for anybody else? And what we found was that the options were really limited if you were young and not rich, right? There weren't a lot of opportunities to engage. And so I would say lesson one is like, it is hard to engage if you aren't of a certain sort of socioeconomic status. And two, I think, and this is a lesson that I've taken kind of throughout my entire life, is if you can't find it, build it. And so that's what we did. We looked around and felt like there was nowhere for us to direct our passion and our commitment to the cause. And so we created a place for it. And it ended up being incredibly successful. Um, Made a huge difference. I still meet people. Like, we moved at the time we were in New York City, we moved to Connecticut. And just a few months ago, the parent of one of my daughter's friends was like, my God, I just found out that you started the Pink Agenda. I cannot tell you, she works in breast reconstruction and she's like, this organization has changed the lives of my patients. Like, and so I would say those are probably the two big lessons. I think the third piece is, um, and again, this is, I think, true across the board. It's knowing when the time has come for you to change your role, right? So, we were. It was built by and for young professionals, and at some point, we aged out of that demographic. Like, I still like to think of myself as being a young professional, but the reality is, like, I'm probably more in the demographic that can fit into the sort of existing systems, and we feel, and I say this all the time when it comes to any room where decisions are being made. You need to make sure that the people making those decisions, the people impacted, are the ones in the room making those decisions, or at least have a representative voice, right? And I think we just came to a point where the realization was, we're aging out of the people we want to serve, and we want to create space for people to move into leadership roles who look and reflect back who we're talking to and who we're building for. And so we did. We stepped away, but remain huge supporters of the cause, and very grateful that I got to be a part of it.
Liana, can we clone you and like put you in a million different leadership positions and help your clones run for office because
Thank
your EQ is off the charts?
That's incredibly kind. I will tell you, I know plenty of people who are like, "Oh, no, no, we can't have more of her." That would be scary.
Starting with
My
your
wife,
wife and
she's
kids,
among
maybe
them
days.
probably.
Yeah, yeah. I trust me. I'm part of that club. My wife feels the same way. So I do want to move to current day, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, you are on the board of an organization called GLAAD, GLAAD. Tell us a little bit more about GLAAD and how you chose to and why you chose to support that specific organization.
I've been a fan of Glad's work for, I mean, I think ever since I came out. I think back to talking about the L word, and I think when you look at historically where people's perceptions of our community shifted, like one of the big moments was Will and Grace, and in some ways, Ellen's coming out was not super successful, right? There was a lot of blowback, but even that blowback started to shift minds and hearts, and that's what Glad does. Glad uses media to help shift perspectives, not by you know, simply by telling our stories. I mean, I think that's the reality of it. When like I think a lot about my grandfather who passed away, continues to be one of my favorite people in the world, and he was a deacon in the Catholic Church. I think would have probably told you that he didn't think that gay people should exist. And then I came out, and this person that he loved and adored came out, and all of a sudden, I mean, he was old enough that he couldn't have been marching on the front lines with me, but if he could have, he would have been. I mean, when I tell you there was not 1 ounce of like, I told him I was really worried, and he said, "Are you happy?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Then I'm happy too. I love you." And that was it. That was it. And then from that point onward, and I think that one to one is how minds and hearts change. But if you can do that at scale, if you can show people, I think a lot of people right now have these ideas of what it means to be trans. And then when they meet a trans person, they realize that person is just a person who wants to live. And so I think Glad, that is what Glad does. Glad tries to take that experience with my grandfather and find ways to help support it at scale by making sure that our stories are being told and that they are being told in an accurate light. And so, and that accuracy means it has to be nuanced and there is no universal experience, right? And so yeah, so I guess 2 or 3 years ago, they reached out and asked if I'd be interested in joining the board. And I was just so thrilled to be able to take a bigger seat on the work that they do and be a part of helping to enact that change. And I think it has never mattered more than it does now. We right now, I think we've lost our way and a little bit of our humanity. I think a lot of times there is this othering that is happening because people are, keyboard warriors, and people are moving into media habits that are, very echo chambery. And so I think Glad faces a big challenge. It is the same playbook that worked a decade ago is not going to work now, but helping media as a whole figure out how to navigate this moment so that we aren't sort of spreading inequity at scale. It is hard work, but work that I'm grateful I get to do with the rest of the board and the team there.
Well, they're lucky to have you. And I have to tell you that story about your grandfather brought a little dust into my office, must be blowing through the window because that was a very touching story. And I love that he reacted that way. I know we're bumping up against time. Do you have a few more minutes to keep
Yeah, for
going?
sure.
Okay, good. Because I feel like I'm loving this conversation, and hopefully the folks listening in love it just as much as we do. So you've joked publicly about splitting time growing up in San Juan, Puerto Rico, and then Guilford, Connecticut. I'm guessing that you joke about this, I think, even in your bio, that navigating these two societies helped you navigate, and maybe I'm making this word up, by dichotomous cultures,
Yeah.
because you do straddle these two very different cultures on a lot of different levels. So, talk a little bit about what that was like and how that's helped you navigate.
Yeah. So, it's interesting. I think you kind of know what you know. And so for me, it didn't feel like, I think only as an adult when people sort of point out, or as an adult when I've looked back at the experiences, I'm like, oh wow, yeah, those are pretty different. But it didn't feel to me that way at the time because my mom grew up in Connecticut, my dad grew up in Puerto Rico, and we always, I spent the first half of my childhood in Puerto Rico, but we always did summers here with my grandparents, and then my parents divorced and we swapped. I will say, I think what I have loved though is that there are elements of each culture that I have been able to adopt that like I've been able to kind of build my identity based on which parts resonated most. I will say my wife, when we went back to Puerto Rico, or when I went to Puerto Rico with her for the first time, said like, my voice changes, the way that I speak changes. Like I am innately a Puerto Rican, and that's probably like if I were to really try to figure out like what is more of me. But I will say, I think one of the things I think a lot about is women, strong women in the Puerto Rican culture. It's funny. I think a lot of people think of the Puerto Rican culture as being patriarchal, and it is, I think, in some ways, but strong women are a central part of the culture.
Hmm.
Like they're, and women are expected to have opinions and to state them loudly. And I think when I moved to Connecticut, I was surprised that that was not the same here, right? And so but I think I had been there so long that that is just innately who I am. And so, so I think that's a part of navigating. I will say, in terms of sort of how navigating cultures has impacted me, I do think knowing that I was queer from a very young age, and not knowing and not coming out until I was 18 or 19 when I came out, so I wasn't old by any means, but I was still young. That was probably more influential because I did have to learn how to context switch at an early age. I had to learn, like, how gay can you be and how do you have to position yourself so that people won't maybe accuse you of being gay while still being true to yourself. And so I think actually even more than the dichotomy of Puerto Rico and Connecticut is the dichotomy of being this, like, very clearly queer person in a very straight world and having to navigate how I could live in both of those places in a way that was really authentic.
Appreciate the answer. One last question, and then we'll get into a few more personal questions. And that is for those of us that are allies to the LGBTQIA plus, want to make sure I get all those in there, to that community, how do we better support our friends, especially during the turbulent times that, we seem to be experiencing right now?
Yeah, I thank you for asking this question. I think it is such an important one. I think the reality is it is much riskier for members of our community to stand up right now than it is for our cis and straight counterparts. And so I think be a loud voice, and I think it accomplishes two things. I think it makes clear that there are I believe firmly that there are more people in this country who know that we have always existed, who want us to continue to exist freely, who want us to exist in a world where we can love and be loved and be part of, live full, rich lives. And I think making it clear to those who are very loudly in the opposite camp, if you're loud, right now they're just louder than a lot of the people on this camp. And so, meeting their moment and being, louder and with greater depth, I think will go a long way in making it clear to them that these are not policies that America as a whole is interested in. And then two, I think it's back to that being seen. I think for a lot of us, I'm very lucky. Like, I'm cis, so I'm not trans. I live in Connecticut, which is a very blue state. There are some, the governor here is already talking about shield laws to protect members of our community. So I'm really fortunate, but there are people who look exactly like me in very red states who are scared for their livelihood. And then there are people who are trans across the US who are waking up every day to a new onslaught of hatred. And I think for them, hearing those loud voices just confirms that they have allies, that they have safe places in this country where they are seen and valued, and that these loud voices are not the majority. So I would just say, like, continuing to be loud and standing up for this community.
Great advice. Thank you for sharing that. And I will definitely help carry that forward and use that as a touchstone. And hopefully, our listeners will take heed to that as well. So, this is the point where I want to shift into learning a little bit more about you personally for our listeners' sake. And personally, I like to do this part as well. So, one of the fun ones that I sort of bring back and forth, but it's what's a word that sounds dirty but isn't?
This is such an interesting question. Um, Dongle.
Dingle. Wow. You know what? No one's brought that one up. I gave you the example of masticate because it actually got used 3 times. I'm like, if I use it as an example, people won't use it. So
Yep.
dongle's a good one. Actually,
Yeah.
that's a really good one.
It's a
Do you know
ridiculous
what a
word.
do you know what a dongle is? Do people listening know what a dongle is?
It is the connector that you use for your computer. Like, if you want to connect to, like, an HDMI, you'll often use a dongle.
That's right. I remember using it like when we had to do presentations at work and saying it, and I was feeling a little ashamed to say that word. So great choice. I know you've had a chance to meet some amazing people over the course of your life, and we've talked about a few of them earlier, but who that you've met has impressed you the most?
So, you sent this to me ahead of time, and I thought a lot about it, and I was kind of struggling to come up with a specific name. And then I realized that the reason is because I'm not so much impressed by titles. I'm really impressed by depth. And I think
Mm,
that depth requires a depth of connection, not just kind of meeting someone. So for me, look, I'm impressed by a lot of leaders who are out there doing, the work that this country so desperately needs. But, like, if I'm talking about, like, who impresses me in a cellular level, it's the people around me who are quietly making the world more just. So I think about one of my best friends who just yesterday was elected to the Board of Education, and she is raising 3 girls. She works a full-time job outside of the home. So really doesn't have a lot of time to take this on, but is looking at the world around her and wants to make sure that every kid feels seen and heard and has a voice speaking for them, during such a formative set of years. And so, I'm deeply impressed and inspired by her. My dad is facing pancreatic cancer, and the
I'm
grace and
sorry.
thank you. And like the grace and strength that he has brought to that, and his wife who has just met the moment with such a full heart, like that is so impressive to me. And then I will say, I hear from trans and queer patients on our platform every day, and I feel so deeply impressed by how they are living their truth bravely in the face of such relentless hate. And so it's those sort of smaller, homegrown, courageous moments that I feel deeply, deeply impressed by.
Great authentic example. So I appreciate you sharing that. And it's always nice. We had Adrian Grenier, the actor from Entourage and Devil Wears Prada. And he's obviously met people like Meryl Streep
Yeah,
and, Rob Gronkowski and others. And his was this guy that's his mentor, who's a fifth generation farmer that he's learning from right now. So similar in the regard that it's the people that are not the most loud or the most prominent out there. So I love that answer. All right. Biggest regret.
I don't have one. And that's not to say that I don't make a ton of mistakes or that I don't look back and think like, "Oh, I maybe should have handled that differently." Actually, you know what? I've one. I have one that actually keeps me up at night. I at one point was working for a company and was asked to make a decision that I fundamentally didn't agree with, but I was the primary breadwinner and knew that if I was unemployed, my family would really struggle, and I ended up executing the decision. And I but even that in the context of a regret, like I I regret that to some degree, but I also feel like it has ensured that from that point onward, I have never put myself in a position again where I would have to sacrifice my values or my beliefs for the safety of my children, right? Like I think they're actually one and the same. And I've watched other people. Like I have a friend who recently walked away from a really big business deal because they, refused to serve queer people and didn't believe in access to reproductive rights. And I'm so impressed by that, and I think I didn't do that in that moment, and I learned it was thankfully early enough in my career that I learned a ton from it, and it has informed the way that I make decisions, but also the way that I lead. And so kind of a regret, but also I think you learn from your mistakes.
I'm glad you dug that up because that is an important one and it's interesting. It's not going to sound anything remotely the same, but my wife and I have this ongoing conversation. We love the zombie movies and shows. And our premise when people are like, "Oh, I don't like zombies," it's like, it's not about zombies. It's about humanity and this post apocalyptic world. And what would you do? And how do you remain human? And my
Mhm.
answer in terms of what would I do if I was alone. So there's a book called The Road by Cormac McCarthy, which I read when my son was about the same age. It was kind of heartbreaking. But what I would do for my family is far different than what I would do if I was solo and would
Totally.
try to be a good person because it's like, look, whether I live or die, that doesn't really matter. But if it's my family's well being, I do care. So you were put in that situation, that virtual situation. And I think people forget that we get put in these untenable situations all the time. And so I do love that that led you to doing what you're doing today and that you will never put yourself in that situation again. Hopefully
That's
people
right.
can take away from that. So last one, this is truly just one of the fun, frivolous ones, but name a band or artist that you wish you had seen in concert, ideally one that you wouldn't have a chance to see from here on in.
I think like God, there's so many. Like I would have loved to have been alive in the 60s and 70s. I saw Stevie
Mm.
Nicks last weekend.
Ooh,
And I think to see her as a part of Fleetwood Mac would have been really powerful. And love Queen. Like, I think there's probably no greater talent than Freddie Mercury, and so to have
amen.
seen him live would have just been just unbelievable. So, like, maybe if it's, like, 70s, 80s, and the 90s, I would, Nirvana,
Oh,
like Kurt Cobain.
you like, I didn't think I could like you more, Liana. Nirvana, I actually, this is my, not to make this about me, but with my kids who are 26, 23, and 18, I say to them, if there's a band or artist you would like to see, let's find a way to make it happen. I had an opportunity to see Nirvana 3 times in the same summer, and I blew it. And then, a year later, Kurt was gone, and I To this day, I still lament the fact that I didn't get a chance. And I do have one follow-up, and that is, did you get to see Adam Lambert tour with Queen? Because even though he's not Freddie, he actually does a pretty good job filling in.
I didn't. I would though. I would. I
You
think it's
should.
like
It's fun. It's
yeah.
really fun to see him.
Yeah, he seems incredibly talented. I think it's like the Freddie of it all would be the although I love all of Queen's music. So yeah, I should look to see if they're ever going back on tour again.
You'll never, replicate Freddie Mercury, but he does a really good job channeling him, and there's at one point during the show that I saw where they have Freddie virtually come and sing, on the screen with him, and it's pretty epic. It makes
Awesome.
the hair stand up on the back of your neck. Anyway, with that, Liana, I know we've run way over, but we'll let you go. Fascinating, fantastic, lovely conversation. I really appreciate you making the time, and hopefully all of our listeners appreciate this as much as I did.
Thank you, Aaron. I really appreciated it.